Chairman, we have one housekeeping note, then please pass the mic if you want to speak so everyone can hear. Okay.
Okay, this time we'll call our workshop meeting together. David, I guess you do the same thing, the airport commission, all meeting order.
Yes, sir. Here, Jasper County Aviation Airport Commission is called to order now for our joint workshop.
In compliance with the Freedom of Information Act, notice of meetings and agendas were posted and furnished to all news media and persons requesting notification. And at this time, if you would please join me in the pledge of allegiance and our invocation.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Most kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we give thanks and praise to you, dear Lord, for the many blessings in life that you so generously bestow upon each of us. Thank you, dear God, for the opportunity to be here with everybody in this room. We thank you, dear Lord, for our first responders. Thank you for our law enforcement, our military, and all their families. Thank you for their sacrifices, dear Lord. We pray, dear Lord, for our country, our county, and everyone inside of it, dear Lord, that the decisions we make will be pleasing in your sight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Maybe I'll turn everything over to you.
Alrighty. I appreciate everybody coming. Council, Mr. Clark, Mr. Kemp, good to see you, Mr. Rowell, Mr. Fogan, welcome, everybody. This workshop is to let the council and the aviation commission that you guys appointed, thank you, catch up and get some more information from an independent FAA consultant on the operations, leases, etc. at the hangar, at the airport. And I'd like to introduce Mr. Mike Hodges. Please stand up. He's here for questions, comments, council. And if nobody has any questions, Mr. Hodges, you must have some information prepared to give us on the leases on the airport and the FAA's opinion on revocation clauses and times, terms, etc.
Right. All right, well, thank you.
Sir,
yeah.
can you use a microphone?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here again. I'm Michael Hodges. I'm the president of Airport Business Solutions. We're a consulting company that works with airports and aviation businesses on a variety of issues. My background, my personal background is I'm a real estate appraiser by trade. Got into the aviation industry about 35 years ago, primarily working with airports on lease-related issues. Our company has broadly expanded beyond that to do a lot of different things, but my background in valuation has led to a lot of opportunities to work with airports of all sizes throughout the United States on a variety of lease issues, lease compliance issues. I've been had the opportunity to work a lot with the FAA, both directly and indirectly, on a variety of lease issues. I also have a separate company that actually manages airports and aviation businesses. We managed the airport in Minden, Nevada for 13 years up until May of last year, where we turned it back over to the county. And but so a lot of diverse information, experiences that I'd be happy to share. I think I'll talk about some issues, some of the basic issues initially. But I think the most benefit of this is I want to be available to answer any questions that anybody might have about specific situations, and I'll share my experience and some of the things that I've worked on or currently working on at airports of all sizes. Do a lot of work with general aviation airports. So I know that one of the big issues at hand here is the issue of reversion in leases. It's a continuing topic among airports and airport tenants throughout the country and the FAA. The biggest problem right now with the FAA is that there's been a substantial amount of turnover within the organization, and so you have a lot of new people that are in that don't have experience to draw on about what has actually happened in the industry and the result of reversionary clauses and what that actually means in the industry. So I'll start with that. So when you talk about reversion of leases, what you're really talking about is what happens to ownership of the improvements at some point during the course of the lease. In most situations, it's at the end of the lease. But in some situations, it can happen at any point during the lease. In some airports, some communities, reversion happens the day that basically a certificate of occupancy is issued on a building. And a lot of times they do that to take it off the tax rolls so it becomes ownership of the airport from day one. The most common, though, is that at the end of a lease, at the expiration of a lease, the ownership of the improvement reverts to the airport. And then at that point, the airport has the ability to lease those improvements. The FAA does not require an airport to have reversion clauses in their leases. What they do require is that the airport has some mechanism in there to be able to control what happens on their airport. So, most of the time it's about getting having an understanding of what happens at the end of the lease. And a lot of times it's just to make sure that a tenant is reinvesting in the facility, extending the life of the improvements. It does not mean that the airport has to take those improvements back. That's kind of a misnomer in this industry, that that an airport has to take those improvements back. They don't. They just need to have a provision there to control what happens to those improvements at the end of an agreement. Yes.
What is that exactly? If it's not a reversionary clause, what is the mechanism like you just mentioned?
No, it is. It's still a reversionary clause. It's a reversionary clause comes in a lot of different packages.
Okay.
So in some cases, I said you see a lot of different ways that airports handle it. Where some airports will say, okay, at the end of a lease, the airport will buy those improvements from the tenant. And other times they revert to the ownership of the airport, but the existing tenant has the first right to lease those improvements going forward. For example, at the Savannah Airport, they have that provision where at the end of a lease, if the existing tenant enters into a new lease, they have the right to continue to occupy those facilities, and they pay for the market rent on the land, but they only pay 50% of the market rate on the improvements in recognition that they have been there, they've been a long-time tenant of the airport, they've already paid for those facilities, and so they recognize that there is a value to the airport of knowing who their tenant is going to be, kind of the classic, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. And so that's a mechanism that is approved by the FAA. They just need to know that, the biggest issue is they don't want an airport to enter into something that becomes a perpetual lease. For example, I've seen a lot of airports to where there's language, where there's not language in the lease agreement. They're completely silent on what happens to the improvements at the end of a lease. Airports have gotten into situations to where they are essentially obligated to continue to just enter into a ground lease on a perpetual basis as long as that person owns those improvements. That is where the FAA gets into an issue with that, because the airport does not have control over that property or ensuring that they can develop the airport as they see fit, because the improvements are perpetually owned by an individual, and the airport does not have the ability to remove a tenant for, say, violation of terms of their lease because they own that improvement. They could, but it just creates a legal hurdle for the airport to try to get rid of a tenant that may not be, acting in the best interest of the airport. But it's really about reversionary clauses. Like I said, they come in a lot of different forms. From the FAA's perspective, they just want to make sure that airports are not silent on what happens at the end of the lease, and that there is a mechanism in place to where essentially the airport is not giving away the rights for a tenant to occupy that property kind of in perpetuity. Because they own the improvements, so the airport is in a position to where they have to enter into a perpetual ground lease effectively. Does that answer your question? Or confuse the issue more?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I know the reversionary clause is really the main issue, at least from my conversations with some of the pilots and stuff, and obviously there's different types of that. Me speaking for me, I'd like to see us try to get a reversionary clause that makes everybody happy.
Right.
Pilots, as I've said, when this all first started, we thought it was going to be the best thing since sliced bread. And, we had the groundbreaking years ago, and we named it after Mr. Richards' dad, who really was the heartbeat of that airport since, for decades. And I understand their point of view. And, we need to try to figure out what that is exactly at the end of the lease, being able to renew it, or does they retain ownership of the shell, or, we need to figure that out because it's been going on too long. We need to really get that
Right.
squared away.
Yes.
Well, my question is, you're supposed to have a lease at the airport, but you hadn't paid rent in umpteen years, months. So that's my concern. What do we do now? If they're not paying, they're not rightful owners. Because any place they give you about 3 months and they put you out.
Right. Well, certainly there should be provisions in any lease that for the payment of rent in some form or fashion. There are situations where you have a tenant that may have prepaid rent. They pay an upfront payment that is basically a present value of the rent that they would pay over the life of the lease, but they prefer to pay it upfront. I've dealt with some of that. There was some agreements like that at the Hilton Head Airport that I was involved in, and there were people at the airport were saying, "Well, gosh, you're not paying rent." Well, they actually were paying rent. They had just paid it in advance. But except for those situations, yes, the FAA does expect you to pay for the right to occupy property on the airport for the term of the lease. Now, what the FAA's, what the grant assurances require is that for non-aeronautical property at an airport, the airport must get fair market value and a fair market rate of return on that value. For aeronautical property, they say the rent that you receive must be fair, reasonable, and equitable. So what that means is that you can take into consideration other factors such as the lease term, the capital investment that a tenant makes, the other fees they may pay to the airport can all be taken into consideration for that property. But they do expect everybody that is occupying property in an airport to pay some type of rent or something in lieu of rent.
Thank you.
You have a question?
You said non-aeronautical and aeronautical. What in the airport is non-aeronautical? Or give me an explanation of each.
Well, like an office building on an airport, or some type of an industrial building that is not used for aeronautical. If it doesn't have the ability to accommodate an aircraft taxiing to the property from the airport, then generally it's considered non-aeronautical. At some airports, you'll see they'll have a gas station or an industrial building or an office building or some type of retail, but on an area that is kind of off the main flight line. And that would be a non-aeronautical use.
Then we had, I guess just get a little broader. Some of the questions we had that were happening there is that people were using the hangars for other things other than airlines or other than airplanes.
Aircraft.
Is that considered non-aeronautical then?
No, that is a non-aeronautical use of an aeronautical property. That is something the FAA does have an issue with, because aeronautical properties, hangars on an airport, need to be used first and foremost for the storage of aircraft, for an aeronautical use. Now, if you have an airport that, for example, there are some airports out there that have, they may have 300 or 400 hangars, and there's not the demand there for somebody to put an aircraft in every hangar. So the airport can lease those hangars, those vacant hangars, for non-aeronautical use, but only on an interim basis until there is demand for them for aircraft. At that point, they have to be converted back to aeronautical use. But there is actually a regulation that an advisory circle the FAA issued probably about 3 or 4 years ago about the non-aeronautical use of hangars on an airport, and that is an issue with them. You can have a kind of an ancillary use of the air, but you need to have an aircraft in there. But you can have, like, if you had an aircraft in there and you have a car parked in a corner, that's one thing. But if you don't have any aircraft, or you have an aircraft that's in about 47 different parts, and you have 3 cars parked in there, that's where the FAA would have an issue. Yes.
Thank you. Do you have any examples or options as far as the different reversionary clauses that could be considered today to put out to the pilots or do the pilots have any suggestions on any of that for leases and stuff?
We don't have anything prepared as an alternate, do we, Richard? I think that probably
What would be most important for the pilots to hear is that existing hangars would be eligible for long-term leases and some mechanism for renewal, maybe 1 or 2. We have basically our leasing policy treats a new build differently than it does an existing hangar. So if you built something brand new, you might be eligible for 25, 35, 45 years dependent upon the use, okay? But for existing hangars, there's really no option for a long-term lease unless you're currently, I guess, maybe in a lease and your current lease maybe offers you 2 5-year renewals. They may say, okay, you can have 15 based on a 5-year lease and 2 renewals.
Okay. As part of your preparation, were you given our policies and our current leases and our corrective action plans we've had to follow over the last few years with the FAA?
I've received some of that. I haven't received.
Because we've tried to do what the FAA said, what you just said. Right? There's got to be a termination point. The county in this case needs to be able to take control of that airport. We've provided for a reversionary deferral so that they have a right of first refusal to stay in there at, I'm going to use the word market rate, although it's a self-sustaining rate, right, to go out there, with a provision that if you want to make a capital improvement to an existing hangar, you can ask for an amortization period that is commensurate with the amount of the money that you're putting in there, so you restart your amortization period over something over a lease that's already been out there for 40 years in most cases. That's what the FAA looked at. They didn't say it was the only way to do it. They said that that is an acceptable way to do it and worked in our corrective action plan. Now, I'm not saying the magic words of 5 years that we have at the beginning is right, couldn't be longer or whatever, but that was what was put in there was you basically, if you have a lease it expires, you get an automatic 5-year extension at the then current rates as if it was owned by the, continued to be owned by the owner, which is, I don't know, 28 cents a square foot now, I think it is. At the end of that 5 years, or as you get to the end of the 5 years, you can ask the county to give you a deferral and not have it, and I'm going to use the words not reversionary, the option of, it's the option of the hangar owner to take it or leave it, the improvements they made there, if the county wants to accept it. Rather than do that, they get the option to stay in it at going rates for 5 more years. Or if they wanted to, they could say, I'll put a new door on it, it's going to cost $100 grand, for round figures, $100 grand. I need 10 years to amortize at $10,000 a year, or whatever the actuarial say is appropriate at that time, and the council can approve that. Now, that's the setup that we tried to put into place 2 years ago to satisfy the FAA, because we were called to task for not having leases in place. They said that's a violation of your grant assurances. And if you let people stay out there without a lease, you're in violation. So we're trying to address that. That's the baseline of where we are right now. And I'm hopeful, because I don't want to cause controversy. I want to solve this, just like I'm sure Mr. Kemp and Ms. Clark, solves Mr. Rowell want to do. But we have to have something that passes, I won't say the FAA's approval, because you can't get them to approve something. I mean, I keep getting asked, can I bring the FAA here and have us mediate? They don't do that, do they?
No, they'll come in and they'll listen, they'll say,
Thank you very much.
thank you very much, we'll get back to you. And
you
they'll send you
never
a
get
generic
anything back
letter
except
that they
federal.
pull out of the file, yeah.
So that's where we are now, and that's what the council approved, and that's what staff is trying to work with, having heard the concerns of the airport owners, hangar owners and users out there. We're trying to come into a reasonable accommodation that recognizes that these hangars have already been out there, I think, 40 to 50 years, some of them. So they've amortized their original, and that's what the FAA said in their corrective action plan request. If they've had an adequate time to amortize, it's time for the council to not the council, the county, to reassert control, which means you change it from a ground lease, whatever, to a facility run, which is that the hangar becomes the facility that's rented out at a more marketable rate. So help us out with that.
Okay, so let me address a little bit. I think you're on the right track, and that is one way to go about it. That is the easiest way to go about it from a structural standpoint. I'll use the term politically, but it's more like operationally, it's a challenge because you have that the longevity of ownership and stuff. So if somebody's been there for that period of time and the leases are silent on what happens at the end, it's very difficult to do just a 5-year extension or a 10-year extension or whatever.
Hold that point for just a second.
Yes, sure.
Most of the leases out there that were done before the modern era basically said one of two things. They either said, take it at the end of the lease, you got 60 days to take it, or it becomes the property of the commission at that point in time. Or a few of them, very few of them, said it becomes the property of the commission. Right? I don't know that there are that many of them out there, and I have, it's hard finding ancient documents, but I don't know that many of them that are silent on it. I think most everybody's lease that I have seen basically says you got 60 days to take it and it matures. That's what the FAA is aware of, and that's how they've been writing back to me and the council and the commission when they say, this is what you have from that point forward. That led to where we are now with, okay, let's transition forward. Right? And as I think Mr. Richardson said, we have a different scenario if you want to build a new hangar.
Right.
Right? A new hangar is basically, show us what you want to build. We'll give you probably 40 years, 20 and 2/10s or whatever, how it's structured, with some changes into there. And at the end of it, it's the option just like the others, for the county to take, let airport constructor take it or leave it.
Right.
County's option. That's what we have.
Right. I think there's a couple of things. I think the one issue that an airport like yours, basically any, what I would consider a more rural general aviation airport, is that fine line between maintaining activities, occupancy and activity levels versus maximizing the revenue from the people that are there. So a lot of it will be driven by how much demand there is for people to build new hangars versus the demand if a hangar reverts to the airport, and do they have the abundance of people that are willing to release those facilities. So that's a challenge that every GA airport, or not every, but 99% of GA airports around the country deal with, is that, is the supply and demand issue and the economic returns on that. Now, let me offer one scenario to consider as well as an option. I did some work years ago out in Oregon in an airport that had a number of leases that were silent on reversion. And it was actually a commercial service airport, but they had a lot of GA activity. And they brought us in to say, okay, how can we resolve this issue? And what we came up with is that, and they still have this in place today, they have a two-tiered structure. You can either enter into a reversionary lease or a non-reversionary lease. If you enter into a reversionary lease, it's a traditional thing. It's whatever the lease term, 30 or 40 years, whatever. At the end of the lease, the improvements revert to the airport. Standard, lease language of that nature. And I think the rent out there is, I want to say the last time I checked, it was like 28 cents a square foot. Then they have a non-reversionary lease, which it's still a finite term, but the improvements don't revert, and so at the end of the lease, they have the right to enter into another, I think it's 10-year terms, and it's perpetual, kind of perpetual, but they have to renew every 10 years. But the rate for a non-reversionary lease is double the reversionary lease rate. So 56 cents.
Self-sustaining rate.
Well, no, it's a market rate. Well, it's self-sustaining to its sense. I don't know what your definition of self-sustaining rate is.
Multiple times by our compliance officer that you don't charge fair market value. You change whatever the regulations say is. You try and achieve as close you can to a self-sustaining rate is the terminology they keep throwing back at me. To me, I agree. It means fair market value.
Right.
But it's not based on just what somebody's charging down at Hilton Head or over in Savannah. It's based on the whole package of amenities, the packages of facilities that you have. It's based on not just a, here's how much the square footage is worth if you were to appraise it and get rid of it.
Yes and no. Yes and no.
That's cutting hairs, but
No.
it's trying to get to.
I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. The problem is that 98% of every GA airport in this country is not self-sustaining. There is some level of subsidy, and the only ones that I'm aware of that are self-sustaining, except for only a couple, have an exorbitant amount of non-aeronautical leases that provide substantial revenue streams to offset that. So the issue, what the FAA says for general aviation airports is that you should have a goal of self-sustainability. Commercial service airports, they have a mandate of self-sustainability, whereas a GA airport should have a goal of self-sustainability. So what that means is that you don't use kind of what's called a residual effect, where you say, okay, our expenses are X, and you divide it by, you know, the amount of square footage out there, and you allocate the rents accordingly to make yourself self-sustaining.
If I might add, if you did that, council, that would be $30,000 a year lease fee that would be charged to the 42 tenants. If you take the $1.3 million operating fee a year, divide it by 42 hangars, if you were trying to make these hangars sustain that airport, we'd be paying $30,000 a year ground lease each.
And that was going to be my point, is that for most general aviation airports, if you do that approach, you're going to create an environment that you're not going to have any tenants at your airport, because it's not economically feasible for.
We've never done that.
Right. No, I'm just saying, but there
We've come
are.
up with our own formula that has met the FAA standards, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm just saying, there are airports out there that have tried to do that. And that they'll have a fuel flowage fee of 50 cents a gallon. And it's just not, you know, they get some people that pay 50 cents a gallon, they get half as many people buying fuel as if it was, you know, 25 cents a gallon or 10 cents a gallon. So, you know, and general aviation airports have to be mindful of what the market is, the airports they're competing with in a region, but then they have to recognize that, you know, what value does the airport have to the community, and what is the community willing to do to subsidize that airport because of the economic benefits that it does provide.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask, do we have an issue with the rates as they are now?
28 cents per square foot, is that what you?
No, there's no issue with that. My point was, just so that council understood that if you're trying to sustain the whole thing, whatever it costs them. Yeah, and that's not the intent.
I just want everybody to understand that.
Yeah, sure.
I think we're okay on that.
Yeah.
The reversion is the issue.
Yeah. Let's,
I just want to lay another fact out that I'm having to deal with, all right? Because I become the point of the spear with the FAA because they communicate and ask me to respond to it. The FAA has specifically stated in a letter, right, that our failure to have the residual value of the property improvements, which in the prior leases is what we're talking about here, the airport county directs the tenant to leave on the property at the end of the lease, to accrue directly and only to the airport, could be a potential violation of ground insurance 24 fee and rental structure and ground insurance 25 airport revenue. That's what they wrote to me when we talked about how do we set up these rental structures, right? And that's what we have struggled to come forward. I have struggled to come forward with a rental program that says, okay, you get to take your stuff at the end if you've been there long enough to have advertising out there, and yet not violate what they're saying there, which is we have an option to keep it, which is a little murky at that point, but maybe it gets us there so that we're not violating what they said don't violate in a specific letter they wrote.
I'm going to say this because you've already said there's nobody from the FAA in the room. So what I'm going to say, the problem with the FAA is that nobody within that organization has ever run an airport. And most of the time they've only been to an airport because they're flying out or that they're coming to inspect you to write a letter of that nature. They know nothing about the business side of airports.
But
and
they do
so
they do approve the grants.
Well, I understand that, but the problem is, and it's gotten, the reason I brought up earlier about the turnover within the FAA, they're creating a lot of issues like this at a lot of airports because they don't understand. You've got people now that are in charge that do not understand the ramifications. They just come to the airport and say, you just need to do this. Well, you have tenants out there that are willing to pay. And, you know, activity breeds activity at an airport. And so if you create an environment where nobody wants to lease property on your airport, you're in compliance with the FAA regulations, but then you'll never be self-sustaining. So it's a fine line there. I think what the FAA, that the approach that I would recommend to you is to come up with a plan about how you're going to do it, just like you talked about. We're going to have, you know, new leases. We're going to have language that is clear and concise about what happens at the end of the lease and the provisions for reversion, whatever mechanism you decide is in the best interest of the county and at the airport and the users of the airport. With the existing leases having some type of provision about how it's going to work, that you have a plan to get into compliance. It can't happen overnight. The FAA thinks that an airport just flips a switch, and you can get all your leases in one particular format within 30 days. I had this issue at an airport out in California where they wrote a letter and said, you've got all these leases that aren't in compliance. And we came back and said, okay, here's the situation. Here's our plan to get in compliance, but it's going to take us, 6, 7, 8 years to get in compliance because we have leases that are staggered there. We can't do anything about an existing lease until it reaches a certain, term. And so, and they ultimately backed off in that situation. I think that's the way you have to deal with it in this.
And I think that's what I've done on behalf of the council at this point, to say, here's a plan. It's going to take us 5 to 10 to 15 years to get it all straightened out. And in the midst of that, you're going to have, hopefully, the Terminal North area opened up for hangar construction new, which it didn't have the issues, just as you said, about it's clear and concise at the beginning. I was talking to the chairman. I think Mr. Logan provided me a reference to a county out in Washington, Oregon border that they were talking about new hangars out there. They had 40-year terms on it. I called the county attorney. I had an hour-and-a-half long conversation with her. She sent me their leases. I've talked to. It's really an interesting airport because it's right on the border. One county is in Washington. The city that owns it with them is in Oregon, and so you have an interstate, just like with Savannah, right in the middle of it. And they, I have their leases that they use now for new construction, their current hangars that they own, which are short-term, yearly renewal type leases. And if an individual wants to build a hangar, I have all those and I looked at them. They're not that much different than what we have now presently in place, term of the period notwithstanding. Theirs are generally, if you're new, you get 20 years, a new construction, 20 years plus 2 10s. But they have the complete reversionary built in to begin with. It goes to the airport at the end of the 2040, whatever period of time. So I don't know that anybody at the airport commission or the hangars have any problem with our new lease program, new hangar build. If you want to build a new hangar, what is there? I think I'm correct that there's a lot of questions and issues that have come up with the renewals of existing leases for hangars that have been there for a while, and how do we get to the point where, as you say, we're satisfying the FAA's request for us to come in compliance with grant assurances. And maybe my term isn't wrong. I'm sorry, Mr. Kemp, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
You can go. I mean, if you finish, I just want to get my. He was going to go on to something else, and I wanted to get it. There are like 500 or so airports like ours in the United States. Is that what you're saying? Is that the number?
Oh, no, it's more than that.
More than that? Or I saw someplace there was 500 airports, and the federal government is putting more money into upgrading these airports. Is there anything that you know of that's similar to what we went through, where they had no support from the federal government, or the federal government didn't have this, and all of a sudden they got the money and the assurances had it clicked in? You know, it's right now. Before we had our airport was really built, I guess, with just, I don't know how it was built, to tell you the truth. Before, that was way before me. So we had it. So when we got the grant from the FAA and the state and all that, that's when the 26 assurances clicked in, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, as soon as you take federal money,
Right.
You're subject to the grant assurance, and you're committed to maintaining the property as an airport for 20 years.
Now, is that federal money, does it mean if we take $1, does that kick in? Or does it kick in at a certain amount?
It kicks in if you take $1, then you're subject to 20 years. Now, theoretically, you could pay that dollar back and get out from under, those obligations. But when you start getting into hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars, then it's not that easy.
Well, what I'm trying to get to, is there any other example of other airports going through this?
On a transition.
Right, a transition from non-federal dollars to federal dollars. That we could learn from, let's put it that way.
I'm trying to think if there are any
We might be the example.
recently.
No, we're unique. What you're trying to say is we're unique, and that we're going to be the people are going to come to us afterward when we settle and say, "What did you do?" Is that what it's happening?
Well, it's not just a private individual funding and then FAA funding. It's also transition from certain kind of leases to what's currently required. So I think either or may apply.
Well, what I'm saying is, if we did take the money, we wouldn't really be here, really.
Correct. I mean, if you don't take federal money, you can operate the airport however you want.
20 years, 30 years with the lease. Now it changes. That's all.
Yeah, well,
And there's nothing can be grandfathered. And nothing can be grandfathered because you've taken the federal loan, so anything from there on is grant assurance.
Not
regulated.
necessarily, not necessarily. You can grandfather in a lease, but generally not perpetually. They would be grandfathered in for a period of time, subject to the existing terms and conditions. But that, a lot of times what you'll see is that it's grandfathered in the existing owner, but if that owner looks to sell the facility, then that grandfathering does not carry over.
That is null and void, new lease.
Correct.
New confirmed.
New owner, new
conformed with
lease.
the grant assurance.
Yeah, I mean, you see that a lot even in like a fixed base operation lease where, if ownership of 51% or more changes, then they have to go back in and enter into a new agreement.
New agreement,
Correct.
new lease. Yeah, well, I
So
think
the bottom
that,
line, eventually, we took the federal money, eventually it's gonna come into play, whether now or later, the change is gonna have to happen.
you're obligated.
You're obligated, and I think the ship has sailed, because we're not gonna get the money back. So,
Well, they're not gonna come after the money neither.
well,
I don't think the FAA's ever come after a loan and say you defaulted on your grant assurance, so you want to pay us the money back. I've never heard of any airport that's ever paid the FAA the money back.
well, but I don't know if we wanna put the county through the.
I wouldn't put that, I'm just saying that out loud. What my point was, is the old council, and it's been before we took the federal money, that we're gonna expand this airport, we're gonna get a federal loan, but everybody's gonna be grandfathered. It's gonna be transparent, no changes for you guys. Well, I don't think that they knew at the time that you're gonna have to conform to these grant assurances.
Well, the other thing is, as Mr. Jasper said, I think the existing leases you have were samples from other places. They have reversionary clauses in them. You just didn't enforce them, right? That's the difference. Now we're sort of being looked at to have a plan for these, that when they expire, you gotta have a plan as to who gets renewed and who doesn't. And that's what we've tried to come up with.
I think one recommendation would be to bite off little pieces here with the FAA. I said, you've got a plan for new leases, for new construction and new leases. Go to the FAA and say, okay, here's our plan for new leases. Can we get this? Will you agree that this is acceptable at this time? They write they'll write you a letter that says we find no issue at this time, which means they could write you another letter tomorrow, but that's generally the way they do things. So if you get that out of the way, then you can approach it from the standpoint, okay, we've got these existing leases, and maybe you have two, 3 categories for those existing leases as well, because it said you indicated you have a lot of different types of leases, different terms of leases, and so taking that and breaking that down to, okay, for the leases that are, have these types of terms, we're going to give an additional 10 years ground
We are
lease. And
currently
then,
under a present lease since August 5th. We're under review of our response to the hangar problem that we had complaints that have come in there. I've been writing continual updates to our corrective action plan of what progress we've made. I'm waiting to hear back from the FAA now on what our latest proposal said. We're trying to get everybody in to discuss these leases. And they have looked at what we have right now, and they said, that is an adequate and acceptable response. So anything we do different, I'm going to have to go back to them and say, this is a modification to our corrective action plan that we have going forward. We have bitten off pieces along the way.
Okay.
In fact, we've had a multitude of complaints across the spectrum of things, not just dealing with leases. Right? And we have managed to at least keep the FAA at bay on our corrective action plan on that. But the hangar leases, quite frankly, y'all write letters, all right? The FAA writes me a letter. I have to write a letter back to them. Meanwhile, there's another letter coming back in. I have to write a letter back to them, and we're not making any progress. All we're doing is paying postage to get letters back and forth saying we're trying to address the problem, and it's not getting us anywhere.
And my fear is that we're out of lease in so many instances that the FAA really is not going to have a choice but to say you're not compliant. I don't mind the other stuff, like Mr. Tedder said, the smaller stuff we can work through. It's just we got to get past this lease issue. Because better, like you said, they wrote a letter and said they could take the money back. I doubt they take the money back, but for certain, you're not going to get any future money.
Yeah, there'll be no more grants.
Yeah,
You won't get any federal funding.
So I'm trying to get everybody in a lease, even if you're not tickled with what it is, so that we can be compliant.
If I could, and I appreciate everybody's input, but I'm understanding this issue better than I have today. I've gotten a lot of good information from David and our, people on both sides. I've listened to all of it. And it appears to me, and what we all hang our hat on is if there's a new hangar, the new hangar gets a 20 to 40 year lease. I'm not sure exactly what the formula is. And the county at the same time is leasing us ground space for 28 cents a square foot, which is cheap to lease ground for a hangar on for an extended period of time. The county has to have control of the property, I think is the key word, so that it's not ever being able to be deemed anybody's but the county's. And in order to do that, the county has to have some form of lease end in the agreement. So it can't be perpetual. It can't be, it can't be 20 years with a 20-year extension or 5 years with a guaranteed 5-year extension forever to meet that obligation. So it appears to me that there's a formula of some type that I think you guys maybe haven't put it exactly into a formula, but there's probably a formula that you guys are using with saying, okay, if you're making a 10-year based on the value of what we own, that we are ultimately agreeing to turn over to the county. So everybody, new lease or older leases would have a similar agreement. The older hangars may be a lesser value, and some formula may mean they have to be a lesser time frame. And this is workshop, so I'm spitballing.
I believe, and I don't have an issue with it. I believe the FAA will have an issue with that because we are giving away in their eyes the value that we the county, already have per the existing lease terms that said at the end of the lease, you, the county, have control of the land again, and the structure under the lease was yours. Another thing, if you give it away, you're encumbering the property beyond what you should. That's a paraphrase off the cuff of what I think their letters have been saying. That's my understanding. Again, I talked with Stacy Heat from the association. Aircraft owners, yeah,
AOPA.
what it stands for. And I've tried, I've had an hour-long conversation with her about do you have something somewhere else? And I'm afraid she's having about the same answer you just came with.
I don't have anything exactly that works. I'm happy to talk with you, happy to talk with them.
But there's not a magic formula out there that I've been made aware of. All I can do is copy and look at what I see out on the area. But your 2 cents on starting over when you're not putting a new capital investment in at the end of this lease right now. We have a situation where if you want to make a capital improvement, you get extra time. But to just say, you know what, we're going to start in 2024, you got $100,000 value out there, we're going to give you another 20 years to amortize that, I think that's problematic.
What if we continue paying the property taxes that we're all paying on that until the reversionary period of time when it becomes county property?
You're already paying property taxes.
I understand that, but if we sign the new lease with you, it would be your hangar, or would we keep paying?
That's up for grabs. That is, as I understand what you just said, there are some that say you the property owner gets to maintain ownership of it for the exact reason you're talking about, to pay taxes and things like that. Others say it's kind of like a triple net lease. It's our property, but you got to pay for the maintenance as you go forward on through that. But that may or may not take it off property taxes, because if you're leasing from a public entity for a private use, you pay property taxes on that under the state law. So it's back to what is the rate that you're going to be paying, as you were saying, half rate in Washington, I think it was, or Oregon, whatever it was.
Right.
That's something that is negotiable as a business decision, as opposed to a structural legal discussion that the FAA will not turn their nose up at.
So one thing that I was not aware of when I came here today, so this airport, how long ago did you take your first grant?
2015,
15,
14.
Yep.
2014?
14.
Okay. So all of the leases that are in question were in place before you took federal money?
Yes. Some were in place, some expired during that period of time.
Okay.
We have a bunch of expired leases that have been held in abeyance, if you will.
Since then, but on the day this thing all happened, everybody was in, Mr. Dean can talk to them. Everybody had a good up-to-date lease, and no one had a reversionary clause in their lease. Nobody. 42 out of 42. This all happened since this.
2018.
They have used, or not, I think not, but they have used this justification of the FAA to do all of this and to put the revocation clauses in. But as of the day that the state asked the feds to come in and help us with reorienting the runway, because the old runway went right over the high school that was built right across the street, even though the airport had been here for 7 years. Everything was hunky-dory. And once that happened, then the county jumped up and said, okay, your hangar's going to get reversed to ours. And that's when people stopped signing new agreements. And people have been paying their payments ever since, but the county hasn't been cashing on them. So it's not true we haven't been paying necessarily. It's really up there, it's really a mess. But the day that Mr. Dean handed it over, it was straight.
So one thought that I had was that.
I just want to correct something.
Okay, sure.
I hold in my hand a lease filed in 2001, right? It clearly states in it, you're granted the right to remove any improvements on the lease principal at the end of the above-mentioned term at his or her option. Said improvement shall be removed within 60 days after the expiration and termination of the lease, unless the parties negotiate for extension of the lease. Right?
Whose was that?
This was between Avery Cleland and the Jasper County Aeronautics Commission. All right?
There you have it.
So I have researched almost each and every lease out there, because they were in a very bad shape as far as the record keeping's out there. We've had to research records, we've had to ask people to bring us the leases, we've looked at them. But when I say there's quite a few leases out there that have reversionary clauses in it, I'm not making it up. Right? It's there. I have no reason to make it up. I'm looking at it because I'm trying to convince the FAA that what we're trying to do passes the smell test.
I would like to add that in 4 years, following my father's death, that I did a lot of research and was working my way through getting up-to-date leases for people. I believe it was in 2018 that y'all made the decision that the chairman of the airport commission could no longer sign leases, and asked me to stop that process. That's the year whenever you began to offer the leases, which everybody considered to be have the reversionary clause in it. So yes, there were people who bought hangars who had the previous owner had years left on, maybe 3-4 years left on their lease. They did not get a new lease in my father's old age. They simply gave, when the lease payment came due, they gave him a payment. He stapled a copy of that check to the old lease to verify that it had been paid, and filed it. And I began a process of trying to get those straightened out. So like you, I've spent a lot of time doing a lot of research.
And to the council's credit, what they have included in the policies and the leases, you look to see what the expired lease had in it, right? If it had one in there or if it didn't have one in there. And you modify the lease terms of the surrender to match what happened before there was that break. So it's not trying to say, we're forcing you into taking this. There were some that were done that way. We're trying to redo them so that you have whatever the predecessor in lease title had, we're trying to honor that as going forward with the short, I call it the 5-year plus 5-year, or do the improvement value. So we're trying to find what happened and research that, and that's what we did on the one I just did a week ago when we transferred over a hangar. We found what was in there before, and that's what we have now. And that particular gentleman was reasonably satisfied. Was he completely satisfied? No, he'd love to have had a 20-year lease, but that policy doesn't, it doesn't recognize that because the thing had advertised 40 years ago, or had 40 years. So
the gentleman does have the opportunity to come in with the specifications and an order for a door, hydraulic door, bifold door, sliding door, and if the value of that new door is such that we can provide a new lease with some additional years based upon the value of the door and how much time it will cost to amortize that door, then that gentleman will get a new lease, and he's very much aware of that, and he promises to bring that forward whenever the occasion arises. I want to provide some clarification on a prior question. There are 19,000 landing fields in this country. 5,000 of those are publicly owned, mostly by cities and counties. Of the 5,000 public-owned airports, 3,400 of them are federally obligated, meaning that the 39 grant insurances kick in, and we are one of those. But of those 3,400 that are federally obligated, 539 of them are commercial service airports, meaning that they provide airliner service. They are Part 139 airports. We are a non-primary field. I can also say that in the southern region, where most of the growth demographically is occurring in the United States, there are other airports that are in our same predicament. They may have been rural airports, they may have been small town airports, but because of population growth and because of the county or the city, whoever owned the airport, decided to use the airport as an economic development tool, the airport expanded. And to expand it, they became federally obligated. So that's 90% of the cost of the new infrastructure is federally funded, 5% by the state, 5% by the owner of the airport. So we're not the only one that is in this, let's just say, predicament. It's really an opportunity.
So I didn't mean to hijack anything from y'all. I've had to study this much longer than I wanted to.
Right, yeah.
So I'm looking for a solution that my client, the county council, can live with, that your constituency, the pilots and hangar owners, can accept. I don't know how to get there except to have a conversation.
And I think one of the things that's been left out of this equation is a conversation with the airport commission and county staff and working together to try to reach that versus, you guys sending sending letters back and forth. But I actually took a crack at what maybe a motion would look like tonight. Council could direct county staff to work with the airport commission to develop a lease policy that assures owners of all hangars are eligible to receive long-term or some-term lease with a clear path for renewal and is compliant with FAA grant assurances. Set a deadline for it, 60 days, 90 days. Let's get to work on it. If we can't get it done, then we go back to council and say, look, we're at wit's end. We can't get the FAA to agree with it. But we've not gone down that road where the people who actually have hangar interest is actively engaged with staff in a process to try to create something we all can live with. But there's some other, beyond that, there's some common sense things I think that have to come into play. Right now, your lease revenue is virtually dried up as we do this dance. I believe that the existing lease policy is the primary cause that you've had no hangar construction since 2018. You've got an RFP up there now inviting public-private partnership, and to my knowledge, no one's biting on that. I think the lease situation is the key issue there. One of the factors is that I believe the lease states that you can tear down your stuff and haul it off. What does a missing hangar do for your cash flow? And how does it reduce your encumbrance? So the hangar owner's got a lot to lose, and the county, I think, is losing opportunity right now while we have this existing lease dilemma in place. So I would encourage us to try to come up with a process to work together between the Airport Commission and staff and produce a product we can all live with, if that's possible.
My question is, if you already have, you're working with the lease, that the FAA is working with you on. I just came out of Columbia today, and I was at aeronautics meeting, and I'm hearing some of the same stuff. I'm hearing some of the same stuff. It's not just here in Jasper County, but I'm gonna keep preaching it. There's too much hate. That's why we can't reach an agreement.
Too much, I'm sorry?
Too much hate.
Hate?
Hate.
Oh my gosh.
When you start telling people about the animal and all kind of stuff, that's ridiculous. But take the lease that you have and work with the staff on the lease. If there's something in that lease you think should be reevaluated or redone or whatever, do it. Because I think this aeronautic board would love to meet. Y'all supposed to be meeting once a quarter. Y'all meet every week, seem like. And
monthly.
That's too much. See, first of all, you're violating the thing right there. And
no, ma'am.
then, just like this week, we had to switch around.
I'll read it to you.
Command Sergeant Stephen Austin, Command Sergeant Major Stephen Austin couldn't be here because he had already switched, and then it was switched. So he had to fulfill his obligation in Detroit. So we need to get one thing with meeting and stop all this meeting, because that's the one that people all together on the road. They can't keep getting off their job.
Well, I think we got a good direction, and Mr. Richard, I appreciate that. We can, I don't know if we need to, you recommend a resolution, but I think that the consensus of everybody here, certainly the commission, the council, and the pilots, that we want to do everything in our power to come to a mutual agreement that's beneficial for everybody involved and try to work that out. And we can, I don't know what the timeline is with FAA response. I would imagine it's slow. But, if we want to say 90 days or something, but I think just the directive from the council and the commission that, hey, let's roll up our sleeves, get to work, let's figure out what needs to be done and try to make it amicable to everybody. I think that's the message in the directive.
I think we're really getting down to the turn hall. You know what it really about?
Yeah.
I think it's a term, I've never heard anybody complain that they don't want to pay the 28 cents square foot. That's not been an issue. It's not been an issue about the taxes that we have to pay for our hangar. That hasn't been the issue. It comes to term and it comes to reversionary. And I think 5-year renewals just does not really float well with anybody at the airport at all. I think you have to have a basis of a 20-year lease that is renewable. And that's the stigma, and that's been the problem the whole time. And I've talked to
banks, man.
Pardon me?
The banks won't.
Right, you can't build a new hangar without having financing.
New hangars are not an issue.
Yeah, we're not. I don't even want to talk about new hangars. Let's talk about the issue at point. So, like I said, we want to pay the taxes. We want to pay the square footage. We need to just iron out terms, length, and I think the term length is what it comes down to. Some guys are saying, well, I've got this hangar, I only get to renew it for 5 years, and I've lost my medical, I don't have an airplane, and now I got to sell my hangar. Nobody's going to buy my hangar when I only have 4 years left on this lease. And it's a product sitting there, and there's got to be a better solution for that. If you're at the end of the lease and you want to sell it, that's your problem, I guess.
Couldn't the county buy it?
No.
The county's question,
I know the county owns the land, but I meant the shell.
That's why I read the section out of the FAA that said, if you don't take control of what you're supposed to already have, you've got a problem because you're giving up the value that you gave away to get the hangar built in the first place by giving the small lease. That's the catch-22 that I keep falling back into when I talk to the FAA and the other consultants about, they tell us to make certain that whatever you have, you keep, because otherwise you're giving away what the FAA thought they had when they gave you the money to begin with.
Well,
Does that make sense, Mr. Richards, what I'm trying to say?
I understand what you're saying. I think that part of the issue with this is that the FAA is missing the issue that these leases were all in place before there was any federal obligation. Yes. Anyway, so when you made the comment about entering the lease with the expectation, or basically it's factored in there that these improvements were going to revert. I don't think that's necessarily the case, because leases that were done prior to federal obligation, those leases were not done in accordance with the requirements of the FAA for leases.
They were done in accordance with the state of the law and ownership of improvements by the county and how you dispose of things. We can't dispose of real property as a county just willy-nilly. It has to be done for fair market value pursuant to an ordinance with 3 hearings and a public hearing. So there are proceedings in there that have to be met, because we can't give away public trust property, which is what we have.
So who's asking for that?
Sir?
Who's asking for you to give away the land that the hangars on? We've been paying those fees for years.
That's not purchasing it. That's renting it.
Well, exactly. It is a constant stream. I mean, you asked me to put a new hangar door on my hangar. I'm happy to do that. I'm not going to do it when I'm not going to end up owning the hangar. But you say that I can do that, you'll give me a longer lease period, and then I can amortize the cost of it. What revenue stream do I amortize that new door price?
Because you get to keep the property. You get to keep the use of a hangar
Well,
that is worth.
I
mean, I see leases in here for $1,400 a month from other places instead of $1,400 a year.
Excuse me. Is there a way, I know that the government and other things, they look at it and say, okay, if you have a plan to get to the goal, right? So you had talked about grandfathering, for example. So could we grandfather in we have, most of these pilots, if I'm not mistaken, have been here for a while, correct?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So we grandfather and again, we're spitballing, I just want to say, that we grandfather in and we step it up. And if they decide to sell, then the person who's buying has to go to the new lease.
Yeah.
I mean, is that something that is viable? Because once we do that, then it's just going to naturally.
I think the FAA's response to that would be, I think it's a good idea, but I think the FAA's question is going to be, well, what happens if that person that's grandfathered hangs onto the property, and at what point does that
we're saying what I would say is, okay, we tell everyone, and I'm not versed in all this, but say 20 years. We give them 20 years, right? After 20 years, they know that they're going to have to change. If they decide, by whatever reason, they want to bail out or want to go someplace else, they don't have a plane or whatever, that lease stops. And then whoever gets that has to go to the new lease.
That's close to what I was going to suggest. My recommendation was going to be that the existing leases, first thing I think the FAA is going to want for you is that any lease, anything that's worked out, needs to be subject to a new lease, a new agreement, what I'll call state-of-the-art.
Hold that thought, because that's what we're doing right now. We've had some leases that were sold that had 10 or 12 years left on them. They go to the new lease form and they get the 12, 13, whatever years.
Right.
We honor what the leases out there. We're not cutting them off. Right? But they go to the new lease form. It clearly says that at the end of the term, it either goes away or becomes a property of the county. That's why.
And I say some of these older leases that probably have, inconsistent language from what now is your standard lease. That is going to be an important part of the whole thing, is getting into a standardized lease that everybody is subject to the same language, same agreement, same general terms.
We also use that, we also get there because when there's just like almost every other airport I've seen, there's an anti-assignment clause in there. The assignment has to be approved by the county or airport commissioner, whomever at that point. We're allowing those assignments, but with the new lease.
Well, the assignment language, the standard assignment language is in just about every lease, aviation lease in the country, is that the airport sponsor has the right to approve any assignment. Said assignment shall not be unreasonably withheld.
And so we're not being unreasonable, in my opinion, when we say your form is 10 years old. Here's the new form. It deals with insurances and subrogation and things like that. We're not messing with your term, but you got to pay the going rates.
I don't know if that has been challenged, because because normally when that happens, there's going to be a change in the language somewhere or the other that may be questionable. What I was going to suggest is that we'll just take his recommendation of 20 years. Everybody that's an existing leaseholder on the airport signs a new lease for 20 years. That is explicitly states that at the end of that lease, it's not renewable. Any improvements revert to the county. Very clear, very concise. At that point, you enter into negotiations. If you've got multiple people that are looking to lease hangars on the airport at that time, you can do a request for proposal or a bid process, or however you want to do it. But you draw a line in the sand. You say, okay, here's a new agreement. If you have an existing agreement on the airport, you're gonna sign a new agreement for 20 years, and subject to the terms and conditions that clearly state that at the end of this lease, I don't care what your previous agreement says, all improvements revert to the airport. Your lease terminates. You have no renewal rights at that point. And
That's slightly different than what Mr. Kemp was saying.
I know, I'm just saying, just,
Wait, I didn't say, I just spitballing, I'm not, I didn't say 20 years, meaning that's the, I just want to be clear.
You had the other condition in there that if you want to sell it to somebody else.
Right, you have to go and, so, anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Makes sense. Can we do something along that line?
Again, we're back to the term,
Right.
is 10 years, the way that it's structured now, 5 plus a deferral versus 20 years with nothing more. And that's the two options that?
yeah, I mean, you could do, I'm just saying that I think it's important that you draw a line in the sand. You do new agreements, you draw a line in the sand. And so I don't care what happened up until now, what your existing lease has, here are the new terms. And at the end of that agreement, you know, we're starting all over again. So you have, this is the importance of that from the FAA's perspective. It's going to be, we're treating everybody equitably. We have these existing leases that have been in place for a long time. There's a lot of conflicting language in there. There's a lot of miscommunication about what happens to the ownership of improvements, or maybe there's some some inconsistent language in some of the agreements about what happens. This way you're saying, okay, we're trying to come up with what is fair and reasonable to everybody, avoiding litigation, avoiding dragging this out. We now have a plan of that, over the next 20 years, we're going to enter into new agreements. If somebody wants to build hangars on the airport, that's going to be a 40-year lease. And, and at the end of that, then the improvements are going to revert. But I mean, basically you have two leases. The airport, everybody is under one lease or the other. And you're setting a finite term, and you're setting a point in the future that every lease on the airport is going to expire. Every existing lease is going to expire at the same point, 10 years, 20 years, whatever you agree upon. But you have that point in time that you can go to the FAA and say, hey, we've worked this out. We're creating a revenue stream over this period of time. We've got a new lease, a new state-of-the-art compliant lease, and we have a plan. We're not discriminating against any of our existing tenants. We're generating a revenue stream that gives us a goal of self-sustainability, and we're avoiding the unnecessary litigation costs or risks associated with dragging this on for another however many years. So that's my recommendation. I'm not an attorney, but this is what I've seen at a lot of airports, to where ultimately you've got to find a solution that draws a line in the sand and says from this point forward.
So essentially we would restart the clock for everybody.
Correct.
And then we'd move everybody in the same direction with agreed upon terms by council, commission.
And I think that's where the division at. Now, I'm not an attorney either, but I stayed at the Holiday Inn Express. But, I think what we got, the fault is, 5 plus 5 is too short, and maybe 20 is too long. Going back to your point, so, coming together with staff and with representation by talking to the pilots and finding out what that happy medium is and what's acceptable. And it's probably going to be a number where neither side is happy about, but that normally means it's the right number. And then we solidify that, put a deadline on it, and move forward. And then at that point, we just have to continue to go forward, and we'll iron out the other small consequences as we go. But I think coming together and everybody having a voice to come to that number is going to be the vehicle to move us forward.
Just so everybody realizes, you're going to be giving people that have leases that are 10 or 12 years open now, that they expect to have in 10 or 12 years, you're potentially giving them an extension beyond that.
And where that may not be a warm and fuzzy thing with the FAA, and I know they said that, hey, we feel like these things are already in place, and the county should have recouped them 20 years ago. But the bottom line is, we can either go around this rodeo round and round and round,
or I think if we set a plan, even if it's not maybe the favorable plan, but if we set one, you know, I think it's more likely that they will buy off on it, that, hey, it's not an ideal plan, but it is a plan, and it has enough teeth to show that we're moving forward, and eventually it's going to be in place where we want to be. It just might take a little longer.
And to your point, I have a correction action plan that will have to be modified if that's what you do, which means that the FAA will have a chance to say, maybe so, you know, don't like it, or fine.
But with that being said, everybody's got their voice and their input, and if the FAA says absolutely not, then it's absolutely not, and we know we have to come back to the board. But at least everybody got their input. We tried to push it forward with what everyone wanted, and like I said, you know, we don't have any choice over what the FAA says, and we know that we want to be in good graces because we're going to want those improvements down the road. And you point, they might not take back the money, but we guarantee we won't get any more. So, and we don't want to be in that boat. So, I think all the pilots and the commission will be satisfied with the effort. And if we run into that roadblock where we have to go and maybe move that number closer to what they feel is acceptable, then the council, the commission, we've given the Jasper County a try. It didn't work, so now we have to revert back to what the FAA is requiring. But I think that way, it will definitely at least give everybody some peace that the effort to do it the most meaningful way was attempted. And it's not something we need to belabor. We need to put a 30, 60, no more than 90-day window to say we need to have this in place and move it forward. And hey, chips fall with it.
If I may, I agree, and I agree with you, Mr. Kemp, with our spitballing. I think that I was asked earlier, trying to understand the progressive schedule that allowed the county to give you more time for the lease, and it was based on a value, and I couldn't figure out the value if there was an exact pro rata scale. And I think to take that out of the play, if we could do grandfather the leases that were in place and treat them with a longer term than just 5 years, and let us have the ability to recoup, to get some of the value out of our hangar, more value out of our hangar before the ultimate reversionary clause, the 20-year deal, we would all have to realize that we've got all we should have gotten at that time. And if it transfers sooner, I agree with you, revisit it into somebody else. But if we could treat them as grandfathered in and collect a fair square foot lease amount, and put everybody on that, whether they had a one-stall small wood hangar or a brand new Taj Mahal hangar, everybody currently would be treated equal. And I think that would take personnel and everything else out of and differentials. So I think that was a great idea.
Mr. Lee Logan's been holding his hand up.
How are you going to equal this out, though, if you've got 2 hangars out there that were built 5 years ago for $300,000? And you got a wood hangar that was built in 1970, and you're going to give them all 20 years? That's not equitable. Those guys put good money into those hangars, expected to be able to have a hangar out here at this airport for basically forever, renewed and so forth on time, and paying their fees year in and year out. And yet there's a couple hangars out there that are 70 years old.
Well, the only thing we're fighting about here is who's going to own the hangar. Think about it. Because if the hangar's still there, somebody's going to use the hangar. So all you're talking about is who's going to own the hangar. They're going to pay this money for this hangar, X, Y, Z. The only thing we're changing is who's going to own the hangar. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because it's still going to be there. I can't hear him. You might have to respond. They don't rust away if you take care of them. And we're just talking about who's going to own the hangar. I don't see what the...
It's $5 billion worth of hangar.
Yeah. And if you don't own a hangar, then you don't care.
As you say, we can take it with us if we go, but I mean, a hangar's just a shed, it's not an airport.
Well, you said that about docks.
I think that's an absolute, though. At the end of the day, eventually, no matter what, at the end of the day, the county's going to own them at some point. because they all got to revert back to the county. At some point,
That's right.
at some point, whether it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, at some point, the ultimate ownership is going to go to the municipality.
Is that a
The
requirement
county
by the
needs
FAA?
to
Is that
pay
actually a
for
requirement?
that. The
You know-
county needs to pay the owners back their investments.
The county's position on that, as I understand it, is that the tenants of the hangars have gotten a very cheap ground lease for a long time. So the auspices that the county has presented to me today on that is that for such a cheap ground lease of, I think mine's $1,500 a year for 6,000 square feet, that part of the reason they've done that is because they know that one day they're going to get that hangar.
FAA recognizes that in all the letters in the grant assurances that the reason you give a long-term lease at the beginning of the airport construction is to give them time to amortize their investment. And the reason the FAA recognizes we're giving out dirt cheap ground is because there's an expectation at the end of the lease that there will be an improved property available to them. They also put the caveat in there that you may have to remove the property because if you've let it go and you've got contamination, that we cannot spend airport money to remove the contamination or those things. We've already had to do that. You know, we had to spend general fund money to take out for a contaminated, potentially contaminated site just for the testing alone. So there are ultimate issues out there. And just to be clear, the FAA has said clearly and many times, and of course have said, the fact that the reversionary clause comes to the county at the end of a long-term lease, it is not a taking. Here at the end, Airline Pilots Association, they put out publications and tell y'all to look at that. I'm not saying I am saying that's what the law is and that's what we have to deal with. And if you're going to contract around that, you can contract around it. But you got the benefit of a 40 to 50 year lease term, $300 a year to $500 a year to $600 a year for a piece of property. I pay $200 a year, $200 a month for a 10 by 10 storage shed. You've gotten value.
At the cost of $350,000 to build a hangar over 20 years is a cost of $17,500 a month. A month. I'm not paying $17,500 to store an airplane. That's ridiculous. If you want to revert to the county needs to reimburse what the hangar property owners have put into it. And you cannot consider a hangar that is 70 years old to have the same value of a hangar that is less than 5 years old. That's ridiculous. And none of you would tolerate it if it was on your dime.
Just to be clear, the policy allows anybody that hasn't had an opportunity to amortize their property during the term of the lease that's out there to ask the council for a longer time. It's built into the ordinance and the policy because we recognized 4 years ago some people had shorter times to amortize than others, and if you put more than $150,000 in the last 10 years, you're free to ask for a longer period of time.
And I think, I'd like to make a point too, that if we spent, if we got a 40 by 40 hangar that's just big enough for one airplane and it cost 80 grand to build, or if we've got a $350,000 hangar that's big enough for 6 to 8 airplanes, then I think that the same annual commitment of transition, like the 20-year, for instance, is fair to all. The fact that it costs that much to build that hangar's also had the benefit of rental income or the use. In my case, I put 3 planes in my hangar. So, and if you take my 3 planes or Richard's 1 plane in his hangar, I think that it probably would be fair to use the same amount of time. There's going to be arguments from other pilots, but I'm just trying to think of a way that everybody.
It doesn't float, Avery. 3 planes, average rental, and all these airports around here, $300 a month. That's $900
How much did you, 350 by 20 years is how much?
$17,500
A year. A year, not a month.
a year.
Right. Yes, sir, please.
I've been in the aviation industry for about 30 years and bought a lot of hangars. I live in the Bluffton area and I just kind of came to listen to what's going on with it.
Speak up, sir, please, speak up.
Sure.
Microphone,
Yes, thank you. For the hard of hearing, I'll say thank you.
Sorry about that. And I'm just listening to everyone, and I know this is a great airport. Everyone's really excited about it. But there's a couple things, if I can just point out. Mr. Tedder, because I can see your name there, you brought up the point that when you talk to other airports, there is a standard 20-year lease for a new hangar with two 10-year renewals. 20 plus 2 10s. Now, for everyone here, and you say, well, why is that? And it deals with bank financing and getting the project financed. And so the reason there's 20, let's say this gentleman here built a hangar and it cost him $1 million. $300,000 is really cheap for a hangar these days, just from my perspective. And let's say this gentleman, they built the same hangar 2 blocks away for $1 million each. 20 years go along, and one of the folks that built the hangar is painting it, putting new plumbing in it, upgrading it, doing the new facilities, and you drive down the hangar and you see one beautiful facility that almost looks brand new 20 years later, and you see another facility that's rotted, falling apart, actually dangerous, right? So, when I hear this person saying that, well, it's reverting to the airport, what I find is it doesn't, or to the town or to the county, it doesn't automatically revert back to the county, okay, which is this woman's argument, is that I put $300,000 into a hangar, I'm gonna lose all that money, that's not fair. And to be quite honest with you, I think she's right. But with reality, if you look at that simple example, and one's a dump, one's uninsurable, one's an eyesore, and the other person put a lot of money in it, it's about not control of the facility, it's about leverage for the airport. And I think everyone's intentions, all the pilots, everyone here, they love this airport, they love to fly here, they're proud of it. Everyone's proud of the airport. But at 20 years, it's the ability for the town not to take control, but to have a look at to see where the airport is. And if you're at year 20 and one's a dump and one's decent, you're gonna say, Mr. Dumpy, sorry, we're not renewing your lease. You would basically look at, if it was me, I'd say, Mr. Dumpy, can we see your financial statements? Can you pay the rentals? What's your credit? What are you gonna do to improve it? Everyone else is really mad that you haven't done this and you've neglected the property. Okay, what are you gonna be done? Well, I can't afford it, I'm not gonna do it, so that lease isn't renewed. And then maybe someone else comes in and puts $1 million into the facility and makes it nice. And so I can hear the points. And again, I don't really have a horse in this game or in this fight. I'm just trying to offer some friendly advice and listening to this gentleman over here. And I don't think it has to revert back, but if there's hangars that have been here for 25 years and you've used it for 25 years, you got 25 years worth of use. When you build a new hangar, as Mr. Tedder says, it's viewed that you're gonna have 30 years of that. If you go 5 years into it and the hangar's beautiful and it looks nice and someone else wants to come buy your hangar at that point, maybe the town would renew it for another 30 years if someone was gonna really do something great for the airport. But those are the different things that I see that are getting mixed up here. And I think, at the end of the day, you gotta be fair to the 42 people that are here, but it's gotta be kept up and it's gotta meet the new goals. And when you look at a flood zone is a good example. If you look at if you buy a house in a flood zone and it gets hit by a flood, back in the old days,
people would get money from the government to rebuild their house, and there's flood insurance that's out there. And a lot of people would say, I'm not, building my house above base flood levels, which is another six feet above the ground. I want my house to stay exactly the way it is. Well, then the federal government says, well, we're not giving you a grant to build your house to get it because you got to meet certain standards and you got to be in putting hurricane standards in, and we're not going to insure it under the federal program. So dealing with the government is not always the most flexible, but there's certain strings that come with the money. And at the end of the day, I think you just have to, and one other thing that I would offer on the lease is if someone did put a new hangar door or whatever, and it was a long-term lease, or they put some investment, at the end of the lease, there could be maybe a provision to pay by the town to take them out. But the bottom line, these hangars, you're going to have new stuff that's going up, that's going to be financed over 30 years. It's going to look nice. Hopefully you get some maintenance businesses in here, just not all high net worth individuals. Get some jobs going in this place. And then the stuff that's older is going to have to be reinvested in to keep up with the rest of the hangar. And it's a balance and it's a give and take, but that's what I've seen with a lot of airports around the country, and I just wanted to share it with you guys.
Airport in your service not being kept up, or not to be sued for purpose?
I don't know.
There isn't.
Well, I'm not a mind reader, and I just told you, I just came here, and I haven't seen anything. I'm just offering some thoughts. If that's the case, then... Well, then that's fine. So if it looks good, and it's suitable for purpose, then, you should be granted some form of lease, and you talk about new leases, and, it has to be standardized. But the bottom line is there's a certain period of time that you get to use the hangar. It gets old, and it either has to be torn down, reinvested again at that point in time, and you just have to figure that out.
Some of that's not going on now because the county's set to take the hangar.
Well,
I don't know where to get that from. They need to stop saying that.
All right. Along that line, I might add that at the end of the period, if we were to go this suggested route, at the end of the period, that maybe the tenant, under the right circumstance and proper care of the hangar, et cetera, could have first option to rent going forward, obviously at fair prices. So if something along this line would work, I think we could get this wrapped up pretty quick. I don't think everybody's going to be happy, but I think it'd be something that would be just about as fair as you could get across the board.
Avery, I want to thank Mr. Hodges for coming, and hope that we can, with staff and the county and the commission, maybe continue dialogue for your input as we go down this road to try to come to a compromise and get these leases put to bed. So that would be great. Thank you for coming, and thank the commission for engaging him and having him here. That's been a huge benefit. I learned a lot, but I want to thank everybody for being here, the commission, and all the pilots. And I think we all have the drive and the good intentions to make this work and try to find an amicable agreement for everybody. That's what we want. Everybody, I think, wants that. So I think we've taken a step in the right direction.
What are the next steps, sir?
We have,
what's the next step, sir? The next step, what do you want? How do we go to the next step in negotiating this?
Mr. Chairman.
Well,
I'm sorry.
No. I was just saying, the council, we heard you tonight.
Staff in the county and the consultant, along with the airport commission, are going to work together to come up with an agreement to present to the FAA.
There was a motion on the table. I was curious to know what's going on.
Well, we haven't made a motion.
Right.
No motion.
I don't know if a motion is
We
necessary.
have a consensus of agreement to get the work done.
For consideration,
I want to
sure.
tell you, I think we should go to the FAA and say this is groundbreaking, and this would be a model for other airports. Really, and give them the benefit of saying, hey, this is something you've got to look at.
Yeah.
It would be a better selling point.
It's been fun and challenging, that's for sure.
It's been long.
Yeah, maybe you want to call for a motion for adjournment?
Yes, sir. I think that, do we have anything else that needs to be briefly held? I think we need to call it because it's been so long.
Yeah, if I could.
briefly make a point about the duties and the authority of the Airport Commission. Set it up to be purely advisory, and but your lease, I mean your ordinance gives what our duties are. We're supposed to be making recommendations to the airport manager for the airport annual expense, recommendation by grant, purchase, lease, etc., on the condemnation of real property, rights of way, etc. Key piece, make recommendations on other policy and operational issues, recommends plans for the maintenance of the airport, on and on. Where we're failing is that staff brings nothing to the Airport Commission. They went straight to you last night for a mower, news to us, okay? We sent out a survey about needs for an expanded airport. Didn't come through us. We find out things like the purchase of new fuel trucks by looking on the county website and seeing there's an RFP out there, okay? We can't do our job, okay?
We got to make sure that we're communicating with the Airport Commission.
Yeah, it's, and we need to make a decision about every county around us has an airport commission that runs their airport, okay? We're the outlier here. And if you're not going to consult with your airport commission, if you guys are going to vote on stuff related at the airport without ever asking us, or with telling staff when they put something on the agenda, push the agenda back to them and say, I have not heard from the airport commission on this, we're not talking about it. You can get a handle on it. And because otherwise, we're wasting our time, and you're not getting the benefit of the advice of a pilot base here in this community who have over 300,000 flight hours of experience internationally, in combat, every conceivable aircraft. This council doesn't get the benefit of their input, really on any topic whatsoever. Something needs to change. I'm
Chairman,
done.
if I may, Richard, I agree with you totally, all right? But the other side is staff has never had any opportunity to have any part in setting the airport commission agenda, ever. And so how are we supposed to bring you things if we just get the agenda?
If the agenda's been set by Mr. Lucas quite a few times, our recommended agenda's been changed by Mr. Lucas.
Yeah.
I'm just saying we need an agenda setting process.
Yes, okay, I agree.
Right.
Similar to like how the planning commission operates, and then they make recommendations to council. They're not authorizing anything, they make their yays or nays and give it to us before approval. I think it would streamline in that direction.
That sounds good.
What I consistently do is I send out an agenda to everybody, ask for comments, ask for changes, ask for inputs, and I get crickets. Okay, so push back.
We never got the message that you were open to input.
Read the email.
Going forward. So moving forward, yeah. We will put it in place and.
Thank you, Mr.
We're moving forward. Well, I make a motion that we adjourn, and it's been a very productive meeting. It's kind of hard to measure sometime with feelings and tempers, but I think I've learned a lot today, so I appreciate everybody's input.
Same here.
Second.
Motion and
All in
second.
favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.